Okay, welcome back to this is basically the second set of slides here about religion and the Constitution. We're picking up where we left off last time. Last time I ended in the last few seconds talking about this commencement I went to, and maybe you've been to one of these before as well, where the speaker is religious, maybe even as a pastor, but the nature of the doxology, I don't think they would call it that, the invocation, the speech or whatever, may in general use religious language, but it really can't be specific. I found it kind of just amusing. But that leads us to the next case, Lee versus Wiseman, which is relatively recent. It's, 30 years ago. And a not uncommon situation where there was clergy at graduation ceremonies, and this doesn't mean that you can never have clergy at graduation ceremonies, of course, but it has to be done with great sensitivity to the Constitution. I guess that's what we're saying. So I don't know where you first heard about the the controversies about religion and Constitution. If you've heard those in a church setting, in which you might get a different color of this particular case than if you went to law school, like a secular law school. But of course, you can shade these in any different way. And some ways of shading this is, there's another example of taking God out of, etc., whatever it is, schools or the government. And again, that's not the case. Many of these cases are just trying to get it right, trying to do right by the First Amendment. On the one side, stay clear of establishing religion, but on the other side, not restricting other people's freedom of religion. So this is what's known as Kennedy's coercion test. Justice Kennedy, who just recently retired, it's an interesting kind of moderate view on the court in the past 30 years, and he talks about coercion in this situation. So you've got basically a captive audience, and you have to pay attention to that situation. He says at a graduation ceremony, it's not just like an assembly, which is coerced anyway. It's a once-in-a-lifetime situation, right? And you have people who are, and not just students, it's like all these other people who are, maybe even younger kids, are there, and they are exposed to this thing. And is that endorsing religion? Is that promoting religion? And it seems to, for Kennedy, it seems to violate the Lemon test, and Kennedy wasn't the only one here. He says it builds on Abington and Engeli and the Lemon test. This is an interesting phrase, right? Think about this for a moment. What to most believers, so think of yourself if you're a believer, what to most believers may seem nothing more than a reasonable request that the non-believer respect their religious practices. In a school context, it may appear to the non-believer or dissenter to be an attempt to employ the machinery of the state, capital S, to enforce a religious orthodoxy. That's really refreshing to hear, especially for many of us who are believers, to see that this is not necessarily an attack on religion. It's more of a trying to be careful about people who believe differently, and ultimately to do right by the Constitution. Right? Which leads us to another interesting case. This is fascinating. This is pretty recent too. This is about 20 years ago. So we have the situation, as you can see with the image there, of students who wanted to lead it's student-initiated, to lead a broadcast before a football game that has a prayer. So it's after school, it's a extracurricular event, it's student-led, and it's not part of the activity itself, it's before the activity. Is that constitutional? Well, it's interesting. So there's the question, and the answer, at least in this particular case, is yes, the way it was done there did violate the Establishment Clause. I don't know if any of these feel like maybe a step too far, or a step not far enough, but all of these have controversies associated with them by nature, because there are at least two different sides to look at here. In 2000, the court, the Rehnquist court, did say, as part of their majority opinion, the solemnizing an event is religious. So getting on a loudspeaker with a crowd there that doesn't have to be there but wants to be there, not expecting there to be religion in any way, suddenly are asked to bow their heads and to solemnize this, to ask, to create this as a solemn event, to ask God to bless it, or to protect people, or to work his will through what's going to happen. That's a religious act, they say. And because that's a religious act, that is, as part of the mechanism of a state institution, it goes a little too far. It said it's endorsed by being on school property. If it wasn't on school property, that would be a very different situation, even if it included government employees. The unconstitutional motive is to encourage prayer. And as we saw with Lyman versus Katzman, that's already suspect. It's really interesting to see these cases, right? Oh, who put that picture there? I don't know. As you know, sometimes I throw in an image here and there just to shake us up. A friend of mine sent this to me many years ago, and I can't help but look at this and laugh. It just makes me smile. And it's important to smile once in a while, and it's important to not get in a rut when we're studying these things. So listen to my friend, the swim cat there. It's good to smile once in a while. So back to our business here. We get into some really interesting questions when it comes to alternate religions. Religions you might not recognize, or you might not be familiar with. What about something that's spiritual and might not strike us as religion? Well, many of the practices and belief systems of Native Americans might not strike some as religious, are considered religious for any number of reasons. All right, so if these are religious practices, what if a religious practice involves something that is patently against the law? Then we have a conflict, right? And then we have a controversy, which is the Supreme Court often speaks to those controversies. They choose cases that help clarify what happens when there's a conflict between law and the Constitution, or an interpretation of the Constitution. So one of the readings for this unit had to do with Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association back in the 80s. And it had to do with this idea of a public road, eminent domain, the right of the government to take over property. What if that property is religious? What if it's a burial ground? Well, I'll tell you, as a basically as a rule of thumb, the government always has the right to take the land of a cemetery, and I'm just being very technical about it here, but and can build on that or build over it. That's always technically possible. Obviously, some people have a lot of reservations about that, and I've actually known city planners. I actually served on a committee that looked at zoning, and I got to know a little bit more about this, and I realized that those committees and boards they're made of people, and they have sensibilities, and they're really sensitive to moving cemeteries, of course, and of course burial grounds as well. So whether it's a traditional sort of Judeo-Christian kind of cemetery or a burial ground, government is very reluctant to build on or move cemeteries. That being said, there was a cemetery in Greece decades ago, that was moved to widen the road, and you can imagine the feelings that people have about that. And how do they do that? Well, they actually reinter. There's a whole process behind that, but it's really interesting. Again, under the law, the eminent domain rule. So if you want to know more about that, let me know. I find that fascinating. So of course, this was upheld. This idea of eminent domain, but it can encroach a little bit on that First Amendment freedom of religion. So those are kind of some interesting controversies there. What about a situation like this? Some Native Americans, as a religious practice, include the use of a hallucinogenic drug known as peyote. So think, for example, of if you're a Christian, of the Holy Communion, how important and central that is in your religious practice, and to have to be discriminated against for using that. Well, this is not exactly the same situation, of course, but we're thinking about something you consume for religious reasons that is somehow seen as in violation of a state law. So what happened in again, this is part of the reading, and so I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Peyote is used in religious ceremonies, and we have this employee who is fired, and sought unemployment benefits, and they were denied because he failed the drug test because of peyote. So what's interesting is states are allowed to make exemptions for peyote, and is not allowed by the Free Exercise Clause. Even though many states are legalizing marijuana, medical marijuana, and some recreational marijuana, it's still technically against federal regulations. So if the government wanted to, and if they want to be technical about it, they could prosecute some of these cases. Again, that might often fall into the category of moribund. If there's not will or interest or even resources to enforce that, it's basically defunct, right? Which is one of my favorite words of all time, defunct. So a few other things here. So here's a fascinating one. So bear with me, because again, we're drawing these dots that we can connect to understand the border of what's acceptable and what's not when we look at justiciable situations. So Murdock versus Pennsylvania in 1943. All right, so we have this this very interesting case where we have the requirement in an area. This is not unusual. You have to get a permit to go door to door to solicit something, that is to ask for something, or even to give something. So what if you're a religious community like Jehovah's Witness? This is another Jehovah's Witness case, where a deeply held religious belief is to share this information face to face with someone else, to go among your community, knock on doors, give them religious literature. Does that violate that freedom of religion? Does that violate that? So if they're selling religious books or giving religious pamphlets door to door, does requiring an ordinance, does that sort of create an undue burden on that freedom? It should be free, right? It is free, but what is reasonable and what is not? So there's no taxation for religious distribution by local, state, or law, they say. And it's unconstitutional to impose tax on any other First Amendment freedom. So why would this be acceptable? So in the Murdock case, what's interesting is they say not only in this situation is there a free exercise issue, right? So it's restricting people from going door to door, sharing their religious views, but it also restricts this freedom of the press. So you can have these interesting cases that have nuances to them that connect to the Bill of Rights or other parts of the Constitution in different ways, and this is one of those. Let's see. So along those lines, I'll give you another one here. So Cox versus New Hampshire, around the same time, they said it is reasonable. A reasonable fee for a police or religious parade or carnival is acceptable. So it's not placing an undue burden on that religious practice. If they want to have a carnival, maybe I've been to the Greek Orthodox festival run specifically by the church. The Ukrainian church festival, I've gone to that. I've been to a few things like that, and it's not unconstitutional to reasonably ask for police protection, for sanitation and things like that, for a state or a county or a city to ask for that. That doesn't place an undue burden. Interestingly enough, there's another case about Jehovah's Witnesses. What about children? What if it's children who are going door to door, sharing their religious material when they're minors? So now what's interesting is we have a labor issue as well and a consent issue. So child labor laws actually do apply to children who distribute religious literature. That's not unreasonable, especially for after it gets dark, after regular hours. And so that's what the Supreme Court said in 1944. I'll just add this last one. You might ask, well, what about manger scenes? Well, here's one of the key latest leading cases about manger scenes. It's not the only one, but one of the leading ones about a creche or manger scene allowed on public property, not purely religious. Interestingly enough, this might surprise you, but Lynch versus Donnelly said that a manger scene in public can be seen as a passive symbol. And so maybe you have seen some of these. I've even seen a menorah in public. Done in a certain way, it can be constitutional. There's more, though, to this story. We're going to take a look at that in the next video. Thanks. Thanks. We'll see you there.